On Patrol with the Suffolk County PBA is a dynamic podcast that brings together some of the most influential voices in the nation.
From union leaders and elected officials to law enforcement experts who explore the pressing issues shaping America.
Through thought-provoking conversations, we empower listeners to think critically about law enforcement, political policy, and the future of our society.
Available on Spotify, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and all Suffolk PBA social media platforms. Tune in to On Patrol with the Suffolk County PBA.
Welcome to another episode of On Patrol with the Suffolk County PBA. I'm CJ Hutter, the treasurer of the PBA.
I'm Tanner Brandenmeyer, the sergeant at arms of the PBA.
And today joining us is Chris Wolf. Chris is the Suffolk PBA's legislative director, and he's a former 1st Precinct trustee. He was a midnight delegate in the 1st Precinct prior to being a trustee, and he's made a career out of helping cops. Thanks for joining us, Chris.
Happy to be here.
So for everybody watching out there, just tell us a little bit about your role in Albany and what it's like being the legislative director.
So many people may not know what Albany is all about. So basically the state government is in session for 6 months of the year. So from January to June, the legislative session runs. And they introduce bills starting in January, and then they pass them, they vote on them during the session. And from June through December, those bills age and the governor will sign them or veto them. So basically my role is from January to June, I'll go up there starting on Monday and I'll stay up there through Thursday. And I'll basically lobby on behalf of Suffolk County PBA members for stuff like pension benefits, military buybacks, 50A discipline record items. And then we'll spend the time lobbying and try and get legislation passed that's beneficial to the membership, or work on preventing legislation that goes against what we would want for our membership.
Right. And a lot of that is not only to just benefit our membership, but the residents of Suffolk County and New York State as well, especially when it comes to certain criminal justice reforms or like discovery reform, things that really affect criminal justice and policing.
Absolutely. So especially like bail reform, which we saw take place a couple of years ago, that had a direct impact on the residents of Suffolk County and the way our officers do their jobs and the way processing takes place in the judicial system. And what we'll do is we'll bring the law enforcement perspective to the legislators so that they can make an informed decision on whether a policy is good or bad.
That's the whole point of lobbying again, right? Because you're informing them on your perspective on that.
Absolutely. So one of the key things you realize is that whether it's a senator or an assemblyman, none of them are really experts in every single field. So they may have a field that they came out of that they're an expert in, but there are only a couple of law enforcement officers up there in the Senate and a few in the Assembly. But other than that, we become the voice of informing them of the changes that they're looking at. How do they affect either the cops or the residents? Or we also even become a voice for victims. So sometimes they neglect the idea of the victims. And that's something that we see every day as cops. And we have to give a voice to those people and what that change may actually do to someone who it may be a future victim of a criminal.
We've been up there a number of times and we see how persistent you have to be in the hallways up there because you really have to convince them of your side. Because sometimes the party's view on something might be alternative to what our view is on something. And as oftentimes with law enforcement bills, it affects us. So I know how persistent you have to be. It's like a full-time job. You're working all day long up there.
Absolutely. And it's funny. You said something that the party's view. What you start to realize is there's an undercurrent behind just dealing with the legislators, which is there's politics. Albany is all politics all the time. And you have the Democratic Party in New York has complete power. They have the governor's office, they have the Senate, and they have the Assembly. So they have full power up there. So if the party has an agenda, regardless of who you speak to, sometimes they're beholden to a position. And that's where what you talk about, you could spend the entire day visiting office to office, knocking on doors, having meetings with these people and trying to get them to understand the importance of the position that we're taking and why they should vote no against something that's negative or for something that's positive.
All right. Now, I know what we've talked about in the past here in the office is the city's influence over Albany, the city electeds, right? A lot of the city Democrats hold a lot of power within the state right now. And I think that's part of the issue we faced during the whole bail reform time period, where we were trying to talk to some of our local electeds and try to get through to some of the more, in our point of view, reasonable electeds, and they couldn't overcome their own party with all the weight they had in New York City going against, criminal justice plans and ideas that would actually benefit cops and make our jobs easier. They were making it harder.
Absolutely. So, I've been going up there. This was my 5th legislative session going up there. So after 5 years, in the beginning, it was right after post-COVID. So it was a very unique scenario for the first 2 years where things were shut down. You couldn't directly lobby. So everything was email, phone calls, and the meeting outside of the government buildings. After that, the last couple of years, the influence of the city, obviously the anti-police movement, the defund the police movement was embraced by the New York City delegation, and they pushed that agenda in Albany, and it was very hard to overcome. And what we saw specifically, especially this year, was a very unique situation where you have some electeds in the city areas like Queens and Brooklyn who are definitely seeing things in a new light. Mm-hmm. They're pro-law enforcement. They realize, none of them will ever sit there and admit directly like, oh my goodness, you guys were right all along. Our policies were wrong. That would damage their standing in the party. But what they'll end up doing is saying, hey, that's a good idea. We saw, especially this session, they were more receptive to police reforms, to ideas that were beneficial to victims, to pension reforms for police officers and stuff. So it was definitely a different type of session. You could almost say, if it's a pendulum, it's starting to swing back the other way.
That's great to hear, because we always ask of the electeds to maintain those open lines of communication with us and to, take our opinions as law enforcement experts seriously when you're making decisions about law enforcement. So it's great to hear that some of these electeds that have been around are now seeing that, all right, maybe this bail reform was a failed experiment. Maybe it was detrimental to our society. And maybe we do have to roll back pieces here and there to try to get back to a little bit more normalcy where police are comfortable doing their jobs to keep everybody safe.
Absolutely. And, you could do a deep dive into the politics behind it. You have the presidential election, you have the last governor's election and stuff. There might have been lessons learned. And I'm no political expert whatsoever, but, there are people who analyze these things and you wonder why they are shifting their direction and stuff. But what I have absolutely seen was an interest in what I would say fixing some of the issues that came out of where we decided to go and the direction they took New York State over the last couple of years. So had some absolutely great conversations, some good dinners with some senators who were receptive to law enforcement's position. And they're not really necessarily our people out of Long Island. There's one out of Rochester, one out of Westchester, senators who are phenomenal at listening now and trying to advance legislation and taking our, us weighing in on that legislation. And I see the product of it in the final copy of the legislation. So.
That's great to hear too. And I'm glad you brought up that it's senators and assembly people from all parts of New York State, because we're part of some statewide groups, right? We're part of the Public Employees Conference. We're part of the Police Conference in New York. So it's a coalition of unions that work together to help the working class public employees and to help public safety issues so that police can do their jobs.
Absolutely. So what even our members may not realize is, although I'm the lobbyist and I'm a state registered lobbyist for Suffolk County PBA, Suffolk County PBA is part of a larger organization called PCNY, the Police Conference of New York. They're basically an advocacy group for law enforcement agencies, basically police unions all across New York State. We like to say from Buffalo to Montauk we cover. Mm-hmm. And will advocate for legislation that will affect law enforcement across the state. So there are bills, pension bills, discipline record bills. When we're talking about those bills there, we're talking about something that will affect a Rochester cop, a Syracuse cop, a small village, a colony in New York, all across the southern tier. Every law enforcement officer in New York State is affected by what we do with legislation that affects the entire state. So not only am I up there advocating for Suffolk PBA, I travel with the PCNY legislative group, there's probably about 13 of us registered lobbyists from much larger jobs that can afford to release someone full-time up there. And we're up there every week together, Monday to Thursday, as a group of 13 of us. And there is no doubt that when we walk around as a group around the LOB, they know PCNY and Suffolk and Nassau and the New York City unions are in the building.
That's so important because a lot of the other unions and police agencies don't have the resources that we necessarily have, like Nassau or the city, so they can't go up there and lobby for the things that they need. And it's important for us that they get the stuff that they need and the protections that they get, because that can generally affect us if it starts moving in a bad direction.
Right.
I know, we did the thing with Ithaca a couple of years ago where, that's not really, I guess, so much a state issue, but they wanted to basically defund the police in Ithaca. So that was a big thing. And being part of that coalition really helps us work together and realize, how much, if we work together, how big of an effect we can have.
Definitely, without a doubt. PCNY, I believe, is over almost 100 different police unions. So not all those unions are capable of having the voice or the volume of speaking. So that gives them a voice. And it also becomes a clearinghouse of issues. Like for Ithaca, when they needed help with a radical mayor, everybody stepped in and supported them. And Rochester just had an issue up there with one of their members, and you saw people travel to Rochester to support them and stuff. So that's what those type of coalitions do. They give a voice to law enforcement across the state. And we wish they were bigger. We're trying to get the word out and bring in more agencies and give them a voice and let them realize that whatever issue you may have is probably not unique just to you. There is no doubt another agency, maybe 200 miles away, maybe 1,000 miles away, that dealt with the exact same issue, without a doubt.
And just to clarify the Ithaca thing, it wasn't just defund the police. That mayor wanted to abolish the police department there.
Absolutely. Completely rid them of the police department, move to a social services based ideology where non-law enforcement responded to non-emergency calls and stuff. So you have some radical ideas, and we see it up in Albany all the time. There are absolute radical ideas. You hope they don't get traction. And I kind of, I get entertained when people will email the union, our own members. I love seeing that they're engaged to the extent that they pay attention, that there's a piece of legislation introduced and it's something completely radical and crazy and this great idea. And then I know, well, I already saw that. I looked at it. I know it's not going anywhere. I already talked to the sponsor. I talked to the chairman of the committee it's going to be in, and we made sure they already know that we're on top of it and we're against it. And then I can go and reassure the member that's probably going to go nowhere, or it's been in existence for 5 years. Don't sweat it. It hasn't moved in 5 years. So, but it's nice that they're engaged to that extent too. So,
yeah, I like seeing that too, because, all three of us, prior to being Suffolk cops, we were city cops. Mm-hmm. And I remember in the city, there was a lot less talk of what goes on in Albany. Everybody was always focused on city council, not so much Albany. And our members are very engaged with what we're doing up there in Albany. They're very in tune to what's happening. All our members come out for our pack walks that we do, right? We mobilize our membership to make sure we get the candidates in Albany, at least when they're being elected locally, to help us with our public safety needs.
Yes, definitely. And I like to describe it as we have two hands. We have the political and the legislative, and we do a handoff. when they go through the political process, newly elected, we have some newly elected Democrats who came up to Albany this year. They got elected last November. And then we do a handoff where they get introduced to me in January, and then I go visit them in the office in January and February. I stop in and I let them know. I see what they're introducing, what they're talking about. If they have any questions, we become the resource for them. And that shows that the political machine we do goes hand in hand with the legislative process that immediately follows that, both at the state level and at the county level too, with the county legislature.
Those relationships really matter. I mean, on the local level, we get to know them and support a lot of our local politicians that go up to Albany, even the local ones that stay here in Suffolk County or even go to DC. But then you talk about going up to Albany then, and you being able to kind of give your advice to a lot of the newer ones up there, and even the ones that have been there for a while that might come to you for advice. But that doesn't just happen with a simple text. It happens to showing up often, showing up and supporting them at their own events, going out and campaigning for them, and then building relationships in the hallways. Like I know you've built up there with certain people where you're visiting them on a daily basis when you're up there in Albany.
Yeah, it goes to the reputation of the organization without a doubt. Obviously Suffolk PBA has a statewide reputation, at least in my opinion, I like to think. But, there is no doubt that electeds from across the state know who we are. You hit the nail on the head with relationships. Even our own president needs to have a relationship with the governor. Whatever you may think of the governor, you may not like where New York is headed politically. You may not like who she is. But if you don't have that relationship, if you don't have that communication, you are on the outside of a group that is setting policy that affects your membership. And if you can't influence that or give input on influencing the outcome, you're doing a disservice to your members.
She's the highest ranking official in the state. I mean, it's a no-brainer that you want to have a conversation with her and be at that table when something that comes up that affects law enforcement is coming up. So I think that it's very fortunate that Lou does a great job to build relationships like that. And we're fortunate enough that he can have a phone call with her or have a conversation with her.
Absolutely, without a doubt. And a credit to Lou. He does a phenomenal job with all of the state electeds right up to the governor's office. So there is no doubt that our presence is known up there. We appreciate that where they reach out to us for our input on these things. So it's good.
So, now that we kind of understand what you do up in Albany, let's talk about some of the results we had this year, right? So we all know that every year there's a state budget. A lot of times the state budget has things in it that you might not necessarily think would be in a traditional budget, but that's how they get some bills passed, some reforms that they want. That's unfortunately how bail reform occurred to begin with. They had it in the state budget. So, starting with the budget this year, what were some of the things we were watching, tracking? What kind of affects law enforcement?
So there wasn't a lot in the budget that affected across the state. There was more stuff along the lines of discovery reform. I know discovery was a big issue in the court system. The DAs were struggling to meet the discovery reforms that were implemented. So what ended up happening was they reformed discovery to an extent. Not as far as we would have liked it to have gone, not as far as the DAs would have liked it to have gone, but they gave the ability of the judicial system to now look at any delays in evidence being turned over in discovery and actually have a hearing on the possibility of extending the court date, and as opposed to just an across-the-board dismissal.
Yeah, so. And I think a lot of the public doesn't understand the consequences that the original discovery reforms had on criminal justice. And we just saw it here in Suffolk County last week. We were in court for a hearing regarding the Brendan Gallagher case. And in that case, the discovery of what I consider to be inconsequential evidence, like stuff that really should not matter, led to the suspect involved in that case being released on his own recognizance in regards to this case. He's still being held because of other criminal charges he's facing. But based on Brennan's case alone, the bad guy would have been let out last week. And just so everybody understands what we're talking about, when I say it should be inconsequential, they were asking for the internal affairs files of 100 cops that were somehow involved in this scene, down to, it could have been as simple as directing traffic on the LIE when this accident occurred, right? Nothing to do with the actual investigation, just directing traffic. Or somebody who lit a flare and then left to go handle other 911 calls because other calls are still going on at the same time. So you might have been on scene for 5-10 minutes just to help with traffic. And because your internal affairs file wasn't handed over, it leads to this discovery issue because the defense has a right to the internal affairs files. And some of these internal affairs files are empty. Right?
Absolutely.
Some of these cops have never been to internal affairs, but they still want to see that empty file.
Yep. So, discovery is a process, part of due process in the legal system. In terms of the defense attorney, they have absolutely turned the new laws into a tool.
Oh, yeah. They bastardized the whole point of it.
Absolutely. So, and specific especially to discipline records and specific to regular evidence, they're using it as an opportunity to try and get the case dismissed for a completely unrelated issue, as opposed to getting the client tried for what he deserves. And what totally gets lost in the translation of all of that, and this is across New York State, and it bothers me to some extent. I wish our voice was louder in this arena, but the victim. There are victims to every one of those crimes. In our case, Brendan, but whether it be a rape, an assault, a homicide, there's a leftover family that is re-victimized when discovery is weaponized by defense attorneys and then used in the court system. So it's been a problem. I think they recognize it. Their fixes, to some extent, made a difference. I'm sure DAs will want it to go further, and hopefully that'll be future conversations that go on in Albany.
Right. Like, we talk about Brennan's case because he's one of our guys. He's a personal friend to us. He's a PBA delegate, right? So we talk about Brennan's case often, but I mean, you hit the nail on the head. What if you're a rape victim and all of a sudden the guy who raped you is getting released because some cop who put up crime scene tape in the front lawn and then had nothing to do with the rest of the investigation, his internal affairs file wasn't
basically
turned over.
Technicality.
Yeah, the technicalities that have been bastardized and abused by these defense attorneys are horrendous.
Yes, and they're weaponizing. We keep referring to the disciplinary records. That's one of the biggest problems for law enforcement right now. Post George Floyd, defund the police and stuff, when they made the changes to repealing 50A, state law 50A, when they repealed that, basically discipline records became public information. What's happening and what we see happening, and our members know this, but maybe some listeners don't, is that stuff that is literally unfounded, stuff you've been exonerated of, where they've said this claim never occurred, those stay in your file. And then what happens is during this discovery process, those files get turned over and these defense attorneys are manipulating that information to impeach your testimony completely unrelated. So now you have an officer who they may be apprehensive to put on a stand because there's a discipline record issue when the cases in the discipline record were exonerated, unfounded, or unsubstantiated, issues meaning they either didn't happen at all or they can't tell whether the person making the claim is telling the truth or not. Now he's not on the stand on behalf of that victim. We're the voice of the victims to help put the guilty person in jail. And then that victim no longer has a voice there. And they're manipulating this system between discovery and disciplinary records to damage the criminal justice system.
You could have like 10 complaints in your file and be founded, none of them be founded. So it's kind of crazy how they use it against you.
Yeah. And that ties directly into the voice of the city. Like you said, there's actually an assemblyman out of New York City who is now sponsoring legislation that will basically take the unfounded, unsubstantiated, and exonerated complaints, and it will seal those records. So the things that are found to have not occurred or maybe not have a factual basis or stuff, let's be honest, there are criminals who know if I file a complaint, it muddies the water of my own case,
Right.
whether it
Weaponized
occurred
it
or
too.
not. There's no discipline system to filing a false complaint. So why not muddy those waters and benefit myself? But there's a ripple effect that affects that law enforcement officer's testimony for years going forward. So going to that New York City, we've never seen such an interest in actually trying to do something on behalf of law enforcement since this city assemblyman has now been the sponsor of this legislation. Conversations are actually happening. So they're interested in how it affects us, the damage it's done, and we think hopefully it's been a major priority for 2026. We had great conversations in 2025 this year, and hopefully in 2026 we'll actually get something done with that piece of
I think
legislation.
it's beneficial too. It's somebody from the city that's sponsoring the bill because that's the caucus you really need to get to
Right.
vote for it.
That's that political dynamic we're talking about. Absolutely.
They need to be on board with it.
Yes, without a doubt. They definitely, and the reality is, and I believe this, some of them probably know the truth behind it as legislators. They know what their constituents are looking for, what their constituents want, but sometimes it may not be popular to verbalize it and stuff. So when you get the right sponsor, you have the right conversations, the momentum is there, and hopefully we can get it done, but we'll keep working on it. That'll be one of the big changes for 2026 is trying to fix both a little bit of discovery reform and then especially law enforcement disciplinary records, some 50A rollbacks.
But I think the clean slate really, giving the criminals clean slate gate opened this one up because I think it's very hypocritical of them to give the criminals clean slate and not the cops. So I think hopefully that helps push it as well.
Right. And with the clean slate, some of those charges that are getting wiped off their criminal records, they were guilty of. We're just talking about taking away the false complaints against us.
Yeah. And that was part of the fun of having those conversations. And when clean slate was occurring, it was very difficult to hear an argument back. You almost just got ignored when you made the argument and asked, well, in clean slate, these individuals are literally convicted. And I'll concede there might be false convictions and stuff, but the majority aren't. So if you look at the majority, they're true convictions. None of us are asking for our disciplinary record convictions of issues to be wiped clean. We just want the unfounded and exonerated and unsubstantiated issues not weaponized in court against us. And in the court of public opinion also. You get, there are press agencies that are subpoenaing these records and trying to get them just so that they could publish them. I believe there's a site for New York City law enforcement where you could plug in people's names and look up their New York City discipline record if they were a New York City cop.
Yeah, the city CCRB records, you can very easily just look up.
Yeah. Yep. So, and that gets weaponized and 100%. Used against them, even in, they might have an off-duty incident or an on-duty incident. And the first thing they do in the press is look up the history and make even stretches of analogies between disciplinary records and current behavior and current issues and where there may be no link whatsoever.
And I know the spin on this from the people out there who are very anti-police right now is going to be that we're trying to cover up corruption. That's why we want to seal these files. It's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the unfounded, unsubstantiated, and exonerated complaints, the stuff that cops are not guilty of.
Exactly. And those far extreme radicals really don't engage in the conversation because, as you can see, I'm very adept at explaining that these are situations that either never happened, were found to be false, or they, and especially today, everything's on body cam. I don't know many agencies left that aren't having a live video of everything that went on from start to finish. So when there's a finding, that finding's probably based on you could actually take that politician and make the argument, Well, if you were to watch the video, you'd be the witness to the whole thing. How could you ever come to a different finding? So what we've seen since body cameras have become instituted across the board, these findings actually are more reliable than they ever are. So
Right.
their argument against the findings are actually undermined.
Yep.
But they won't have these conversations because if I was to bring that up in that scenario, there's no way to come back at that, you know? So it puts them in a tough position. So they just stand their position and hold out tight, but we'll keep fighting.
Yeah. These body camera footage, it's been a great tool for us. And, not just on day-to-day policing where it's like, all right, was it in the first bush or the second bush that he threw the gun into when you're writing up a testimony, right? Or when you're preparing for court. But it's also for these erroneous complaints against us, right? It's proving that the cops are out there trying to do the right thing 99.9% of the time.
Absolutely, without a doubt. I was from a generation of policing that had no body cameras
Right.
or anything, and I was off the road when they were introduced and stuff. But as they were getting introduced, I kind of knew that this was the direction we were headed. I was a trustee of the first precinct at the time, and I remember there was a lot of pushback. A lot of people thought, this is terrible, it's horrible. And I was like, just wait and see. I
Right.
think it's going to be your best friend. And lucky enough to be up in Albany and working with departments from Buffalo all the way to out east, Long Island, and all over the state, I don't necessarily know that there's a law enforcement agency that doesn't see the immense value to its own members in body cameras, because they have done exactly what you said. They have supported the law enforcement officers, and 99% of the time that we're out there doing the right thing, working hard, having a hard time fighting with the public. The public is in a different place nowadays. I watch videos of car stops. I'm a social media consumer, so I'll watch, TikToks of people. People want to hold court at the side of the road about whether they rolled through the stop sign or not.
Right.
It used to be when you got pulled over, you got a ticket and they went to court and had the debate. There was no debate at the roadside. Nowadays, it's, well, I'm videotaping this and I want to debate it and call your supervisor because I didn't, I signaled to turn. I made a full stop. That's not where court gets held.
Right, right.
You don't hold court at the roadside. So those body cameras are highlighting that. I just wish there was a way to change it back where the public understood we have a job to do. We're just going through our motions. And, the politicians would understand that the job is hard that we do and it's becoming more difficult, and just give us a little leeway and understand that not everything in those discipline records or in the court of public opinion is as it seems.
Well, you could argue, even after the George Floyd thing, that I know our job is to de-escalate situations, but it seemed like after that incident, especially with Black Lives Matter and all the protesting that was going on, the public would aggravate a situation to make it worse and worse and worse. So it was almost impossible to de-escalate some things.
Without a doubt. Well, you see that with, these First Amendment auditors and stuff. There are people who are, and that ties into monetizing social media.
Yep. The professional antagonizers.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So the more, it doesn't matter what type of channel you have. If you can monetize that channel, then it becomes a career for you. What they've realized is that you could monetize antagonizing the police.
Yeah.
So, we had it when I was trustee of the first precinct. We had someone who, walked into the back parking lot and said, well, you don't have no trespassing signs. So, and it developed into, all right, we have to change the policy. We have to get the signs up. But I can't even fathom, I'm a bit older and stuff. I came from a generation of policing that goes back way back, and nobody would have dared walk in the back because there was no sign.
Right.
They were raised under this idea that my mom and dad taught me, you don't go where you don't belong, whether there's a sign or not. But social media has changed that, where it's, well, now you forgot to put up the sign, so I can go and I'm going to walk wherever I can walk. I'm going to debate the cop at the side of the road,
right.
So it's definitely an interesting place we've come to in policing. And it's interesting interesting to see. And we just try and give it a voice. That's why this podcast is great too. I think it's humanizing the side of law enforcement too for the public to see. So
yeah, I appreciate that. And I look at what some jurisdictions are doing with like a local halo law, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like Nassau County's putting one through. Because every once in a while you see these professional antagonizers, and I've seen videos of a guy who literally walks up to a cop with a donut on a fishing pole and dangles it in front of his face. Like, in what world is that okay? In what world is that even funny? Like, that's so disrespectful, right? All you're doing is asking, what's the win there? What's the win there? What do you want to occur? Do you want the cop to lose his temper over your nonsense behavior? Like, I just don't understand these people who try to do things like that, of that nature.
I think as long as there's an audience, they're going to keep it up.
Right.
You know, the one that bothers me the most is, you know, they'll walk up and now obviously there's a law. You have to turn over a card with your shield number and last name on it. So, and that was done because maybe people felt victimized and they were struggling to get information. So, and I think the majority of cops comply with that in good faith and they're out there doing it. But then you have these professional antagonists who do it. They walk up, they ask for the card, they film it, and the minute you hand it over, and I've watched tons of videos of this, and it's hurtful to watch it see to an innocent cop. They end up oinking at him and going, "Good boy." You know,
I know.
How dehumanizing. You know, that's a father, that's, you know, to kids, and he's just trying to do his thing and stand at the side of the road, maybe standing on a footpost in the city, and then you're taking a law that was put in effect because maybe legislatures felt that people needed to be represented or able to get information from an officer. Now you're monetizing that into, you know, a great 2-second clip. And what they forget is what it does to the cop. Right. You know, the guy did nothing wrong. Maybe you never interacted. And I tried to do my career in the very straight and narrow line. I treated everyone with respect. And I imagine myself, if I was out there on patrol these days and had someone, you know, I'm complying with what I'm obligated to do. And then you're going to oink at me and tell me, "Good boy." You dehumanizing. Right. It's really hurtful to, you know, to be able to
that's a result of social media. It really has. People are fishing for views and likes. That's really what that comes down to. Yeah. There's really no substance in it. It's just how many people will like my video? How many people will view it? How much attention can I get to myself? That's really
well. You could also tie that to politics too, because you had for a long time, you know, politics in New York State were anti-police. You know. Right. We have a mayor's race in New York City that's going to be critical for the outcome for NYPD officers. You have social media posts from someone who may potentially be a future mayor in New York City that call for defunding the police, that says we need to abolish them, that villainizes the police, and then people feed on that. So it ties into the behavior of our politicians also.
That's one of the most absurd things too, just to kind of go on with the mayor thing in the city. It's one of the biggest cities in the world, and you want to defund the police. The public safety aspect of governance is so important. I don't know if the city's going to implode when this guy takes over, but doesn't seem like common sense. Right. For someone from New York City.
Right. And it almost seems inevitable. If you win the Democratic line in New York City, it seems inevitable that this guy's going to be the next mayor.
Yeah, without a doubt. So it'll be very interesting to see where it goes. You know, I consume a lot of Albany news when I'm up there and during the sessions. And you go back last year, and I think even this year it was reiterated. The governor has said, "I will never defund the police." You know, she stood in front of a precinct in Albany and gave that line. This session, as they were going into the governor's, the Democratic primary for the mayor, they ended up talking on the news about the most important issues for New York State and New York City going forward. And every expert they had on Spectrum News up there said public safety was the number one issue. But then you had him later that night. I was shocked when I saw the end result of the primary. Right. So, you know, the city will be interesting. It'll take it in a very interesting direction. So we'll have to see where that goes.
Yeah. And, you know, a lot of this social media stuff and the way cops are painted leads towards this mental health crisis we've been having too, right? I mean, when you look at the news or TikTok and there's somebody dangling a donut on a fishing pole in front of a cop, or you see graffiti, ACAB, all cops are bastards, right? We're all painted in this negative light. When you're out there trying to do the right thing, you grow up wanting to be a cop, try to serve your community, make it a better place for you and your kids to live and thrive. Yeah. It's really tough on your mental health, and it becomes a big battle within. And, I was happy to see up in Albany this year, we got some mental health support.
Absolutely.
So, hopefully you could explain that to the public, like what's going on up in Albany with the Lieutenant Joseph Banish mental health bill.
Absolutely. So that was a bill that was introduced last year and got a lot of momentum last year. This year every one of us who work up there are very proud of it. So basically, a lot of jobs have developed because of the stress we talk about that you deal with in law enforcement. And, they're stressed just from the 911 calls. They're stressed from handling the domestics. I could literally, if I needed to, I could tell you right now, I know the incident that sticks in my mind in my career that will always be with me. The 2 or 3 top incidents that have an effect on you. Every cop carries that weight. Then you add the social media, the disrespect, the feeling that you're not wanted in a community and stuff. You add that weight to it, and that's a lot to carry. So we've seen a mental health crisis among law enforcement, especially, the rates of suicide for law enforcement exceed what we see in other careers. And what we tried to do with the legislation, it initially started as legislation that would give peer counselors a testimonial privilege. So basically, we could start to counsel. If you were a certified peer counselor for your agency, you can now reach out to the member who might be struggling, who might need help, who might be facing an issue. And you could go to him and say, you can confide in me. We can talk about whatever the issue. We can get you help, whether it be through the department, whether it be through an outside independent agency. And this year, we were finally able to get that done with some modifications. It gives a confidentiality to peer counselors in a peer program. What I think is going to be great is now that exists, we've always had a peer team. We're familiar with it. The bigger agencies have always had a peer team that is in effect and reaches out to their members. Hopefully other agencies will now start working on developing a peer team that can reach out to their members and help them when they're struggling, and then use that confidentiality to help lead them to the right resources to get them the help they need.
And those peer counselors need a certain degree of education training.
Yes. Right. So what the legislation does is it defers the peer training to DCJS, the Division of Criminal Justice Services for New York State. They're going to develop the training program and the criteria to become a certified peer counselor. What I believe our peer counselors and other guys could testify to this better is their training is based on mental health standards. This is going to kind of be a criminal justice standard where DCJS will say to be a law enforcement peer counselor, you need X, Y, and Z type training. So once they develop that program, we'll make sure that our counselors meet and exceed that. They'll probably offer training for other places that don't have a program in place. They can go to DCJS and get their training, and then they could start working with these guys who struggle without a doubt. So, yeah. And then that mental health aspect is definitely, there was a loud voice for it in Albany this year. And I think there's a recognition finally that law enforcement is a difficult job. We've gone through a difficult period, struggling with the perception of what we do. And it is only exasperated by the way we get treated, whether it be in the press or whether it be by social media, and a lot of it is based on misconceptions, which adds a lot of weight to carry for these cops who are still out on the street.
Right. And it's great to see the Assembly and the Senate giving us that support and recognizing this need. So hopefully, I know it's in the governor's office now. Hopefully she signs off on it and it becomes law.
Yeah, definitely. And that ties into the relationship. I have no doubt, the PBA presidents from across the state have probably reached out to the governor and, let her know the importance of that legislation. I know they had meetings last year during the session with the governor's office directly where she knows how invested PBAs are on behalf of their membership to get some type of mental health program in place and do something for their members. So
yeah, that's great. That's great.
Yeah.
One of the other bills that I was following and I was very happy to see get through the Assembly and Senate this year was the surviving spouse bill to benefit the law enforcement officers killed in the line of duty. Their spouses would get a property tax exemption, 50% property tax exemption. So, how did that develop? Because I know we started talking about that and following that about a year ago.
Yep. Yeah. So that was introduced by one of our own assembly members down here on Long Island. And it was based on just conversations.
Keith Brown, right?
It was Keith.
And then Monica Martinez sponsored it on the Senate level, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Yep.
So, they sponsored this, and it was based on Keith Brown having a conversation with a widow of a law enforcement officer who passed.
Yeah.
And from that conversation, he said, well, what can we do to help? And there were other pieces. There's one of the big chunks of legislation are always relative to taxes. So I guess at that point, he recognized that any type of financial benefit that they could extend to widows of law enforcement officers would be through a property tax discount. Mm-hmm. And they ended up coming up with permissive legislation that allows municipalities across the state to opt into a program to allow a 50% reduction in property tax for a widow of a law enforcement officer killed in the line of duty.
That's great to hear because a lot of these, widows fall into situations where there's children involved also.
Yeah.
And even though you might have line of duty benefits coming in, right? A line of duty pension coming in because of the death of your spouse, maybe that pension alone is not enough to support the household. Whether it be the mortgage, the property taxes, or all the bills that go along with raising a family on Long Island. And maybe you were a two working parent household, but now because one parent is gone and you have kids that are busy in school playing sports, maybe you can't necessarily work full time anymore. So you need that continuous assistance to help get by in the absence of your spouse.
Absolutely. And one of the things, some of the arguments we made up there was, the average law enforcement officer killed in the line of duty, when you think of the videos you see in the press coverage of the funerals, there are little children involved.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening, and we all know it, children are expensive, and raising a kid on Long Island or in New York State is expensive. New York State is not a cheap state to live in. So you take someone, and it doesn't have to be a New York City cop or a Long Island cop. This could be a small village somewhere upstate where, we lose law enforcement officers across the state. So you take that widow and maybe there's two children involved and stuff. If they're 5 or 6, you're not addressing the issue then. You're doing this benefit so that when the kid is 15 years old, when that pension, the cost of living adjustments for the pensions don't keep up with the cost of living adjustments that we see in the economy. So the argument we made was, you're not doing this legislation in order to benefit them at that moment. You're doing it because 15 years later, when, like you said, she can't work full time and the kids want to do travel soccer. Granted, the tax discount may only be anywhere, you cut a Long Island property tax in half, it's a significant number. You cut an upstate tax in half, it may only be a few $1,000s, but that changes something in the years ahead for that
100%.
Widow. So this was absolutely great legislation to get done, and kudos to Keith. It gets into politics that are behind Albany. Keith handed it off to Jamie Williams to sponsor in the assembly. She's a city assemblywoman. She sponsored it, ran with it. Senator Monica Martinez had it on the Senate side. And once the Democrats had it, we got it done this year.
But kudos to Jamie Williams for picking that up, because a lot of times they won't pass it because it's a Republican that's pushing the bill. She had the wherewithal to say, this is an important bill. I like this bill. Let me pick it up and push it forward, because I know that I'll get the people to vote for it.
Absolutely.
Right, it got done.
Right.
Yeah.
It's a sad reality of one party rule, but at least there are moderates out there that are still willing to work together for something that's really common sense.
Yes, there are, without a doubt. And, I can name them. I know who there are people who support us in the Democratic Party, without a doubt, and stuff. And, that ties into, kudos to Tanner on the political side for what they do. There's no doubt that politics tie into how they respond to legislative things that we need. When they recognize that law enforcement turns out and votes, they turn out for political walks, political action. That's why it's so important to ensure that we're electing people who are pro-law enforcement. It doesn't matter what party you're from. It matters whether you're pro-law enforcement or not. And the political power that every agency across the state potentially has, if they could mobilize it into a political action in their county, in their city, in their neighborhood, whether it be a mayor race, a legislative race, if they could mobilize that into political action and put people in that are pro-law enforcement, then we start to change the whole narrative and the whole direction.
It holds our representatives accountable for being pro-law enforcement and pro-public safety. And that's really what we're looking to do when we do that.
Absolutely, without a doubt. Definitely. And it pays off in the end by having people like, in the Democratic Party who are pro-law enforcement.
Absolutely.
Right. Now, some of the other things that I've seen come through that, will positively benefit, our members is, you had brought up in one of our recent board meetings a new critical incident policy that's being signed by this or sponsored or supported by the New York State Police Superintendent.
Yes. So the New York State Troopers tried to advance legislation that affected specifically just New York State troopers, and it was to develop a critical incident plan at the hands of the superintendent of New York State Police, specific to New York State troopers who were involved in a critical incident. And what the legislation ended up settling on was a 20-day time off from work after a critical incident.
Right.
So you take someone who was involved in, maybe by no fault of their own, an auto crash where someone dies, or the one that most people think of, you pull your trigger, you have to shoot somebody. So you look at that incident, and I think what really inspired the recognition of it for the troopers was they had a person upstate pull up in front of their trooper barracks and open fire with a rifle on a trooper barracks. So, to humanize the side of that, I spent a few years at the end before I came out of patrol working the desk, and you're looking out the front window of your building. Now imagine a car just sitting there firing into your building.
Right.
You're going
an unprovoked attack.
Absolutely. Completely unprovoked. They ended up returning fire, and like many incidents law enforcement is involved in, they have unfortunate outcomes sometimes, and that's a lot of weight to carry. It goes to mental health. So
100%.
This tied into this year's legislative session, really focused on mental health.
Yeah.
And part of that was them developing this program where now they'll get 20 days to decompress, to try and calm down from, taking a life is a heavy thing to carry.
Right.
No one comes to work wanting to do that, even though some politicians or radical people may say that that's what the police look forward to. It's not true, and nobody wants that weight with them for the rest of their life. So this policy, it passed both houses. It's waiting for the governor's signature. It's a great thing and it's a step in the right direction. And hopefully what that'll end up doing, we didn't all pile on where every agency, because you would have had municipalities who maybe can't afford 20 days right now, would have talked to the assembly members and the Senate members and said, oh, we can't afford this. This isn't good. So let the state police have it right now. And hopefully that'll let jobs across New York State negotiate something with their municipalities to say, look, mental health is a problem. It's an issue. People need to decompress from the weight of what we do every day, from being thrown from, like that scenario, drinking a cup of coffee at a desk to shots coming in through a front window. You know, that changes that quickly. It's instant. And that's law enforcement in general, even for the guys on the road, not just there. So this will hopefully lead to a recognition across the state that something needs to be done when we're involved in those type of critical incidents.
Right. And that could avail the police officers to have the possibility of an early intervention when it comes to being able to speak to a mental health professional about that right away, because they don't have to worry about going back to work the next day.
Yes.
Right? I mean, give me 3 weeks off so I could go talk to a psychologist and get over this unprovoked attack on my life, right? Something that I had no fault in causing or creating. All of a sudden, somebody just comes and tries to assassinate me, right? I mean, it makes me think of Lou and Ramos in the city. A completely unprovoked attack where some guy comes up, sneaks up on the side of their car and executes the two of them while they're just sitting in their car doing completely unprovoked.
And you're getting a better cop for giving them that time off.
100%. 100%. Let us deal with these issues and move on from them rather than have to dwell on it because we weren't able to get the help we needed right away.
Absolutely. Well, I think hopefully what it does is it changes this idea that we're not these robots who can come back to work the next day and dive right in. Every single one of us behind the badge, underneath the uniform, is a human being, whether it be a father, whether it be, you know, a son to someone, a daughter, a mom, you know. Every single one of us has a weight to carry, and these mental health policies will make the investment in that law enforcement officer last much longer for that agency.
Right.
So without a doubt, it's a step in the right direction. So.
Right. Yeah, it's great to hear that it feels like the pendulum is coming back and a lot of electeds are recognizing these needs within law enforcement to try to help us do our jobs more effectively. But there is still that other side who's not supportive of us. Mm-hmm. And there are still some bills that made it through Assembly and Senate that are sitting on the governor's desk waiting for a signature that will not make our jobs easier. And there's one in particular, the Keep Police Radio Public Act, that will actually make our jobs more dangerous, in my opinion, if this gets signed by the governor.
Absolutely. So that was a unique piece of legislation. It was kind of, you know, it's been in existence for a while. It never moved. And then for some reason this year, it got some traction. And I actually went and I sat in both houses in the gallery and watched the debate on them. And, you know, some of our Long Island representatives did a great job of advocating against the legislation. So basically what it does is, I guess, at least for Suffolk County, I know we use what's called a trunked system of radio, and it's out there on a delay where the press may have access, but there's a delay. They need to have special equipment to overcome the trunking of the system and basically trace the radio so that they can know what's going on. But if you're in the general public, you don't have that access. So it makes it easier down the road. Eventually, I know there are apps that are eventually able to make the radio public after a delay. So what we do sometimes is we're responding to these critical incidents that can't be have limited access, or especially active shooter scenarios where you don't want parents rushing in to get you know, in the way and stuff. So keeping the Radio Public Act, what it does is it basically is going to take all encrypted radio, or that trunking system, so to speak, and make it real time available to the general public. So what the arguments that were made is that this will make handling, both not just from law enforcement, but EMS and from fire.
Right.
They respond to the majority of critical incidents. Imagine a plane crash or, a large fire scene, people coming into that area, social media influencers who think that they are part of media. Now it's popular to say, well, I'm media just because I have a YouTube channel.
Right.
Now they come in and they're leaving a car somewhere. They're standing in the way, when we may be doing all these different things. Active shooter was the big argument on the Senate floor. All these school shootings, we've always seen parents end up showing up there. All the arguments were made on the floor that the Keep Police Public Radio Act is fair and understandable, but there should be a delay. Mm-hmm. Give law enforcement 15 minutes to resolve the active shooter scenario. Give 15 minutes for, if it's a plane crash, for fire trucks to get in there. I'm of a generation that remembers a plane crash on the North Fork in Nassau, on the North Shore of Nassau County, where so many people came in that ambulances couldn't get to the victims. Right. So those scenarios really do exist, and a time delay in making radio public is very essential in what all emergency services do. So hopefully she'll understand that. My fingers are crossed.
I think this only really creates a safety risk. Like that, there's no really benefit to this.
No.
It's really ridiculous.
I think of when I was in the 7th precinct, I was one of the patrol rifle guys. And anytime we had, say, a barricaded subject armed with a rifle or a shotgun or some sort of scenario like that where we're actually talking tactics on the radio. Mm-hmm. And it's, all right, I'm going to position myself behind the tree in the front yard and somebody else is positioning themselves behind the pond in the backyard. Yeah. And we don't want this barricaded armed subject to know where we are.
Absolutely. Or someone broadcasting that live onto social media, right, where because a lot of people will say, well, you need the guy to know ahead of time and be listening in and stuff. Yeah, that is a small chance, but also someone could be transmitting that live. Absolutely. Yeah. So that spreads the audience and increases the possibility that that person, whether it be a bank robbery or a barricaded subject, or you're putting lives at risk. Once again, it gets back to the victim argument. It might be a lot of our barricaded scenarios are domestic scenarios. Right. There's a victim sometimes being held in that home and they're at risk. And, these arguments were made that it was based on press. And when you look at the arguments that were made up there, they didn't hold any water, without a doubt. That's tends to be a lot of the arguments you'll see. They may not be founded in fact, but that's where we try and bring the voice.
When you think about it too, though, if there's no delay on the radio and I wanted to commit a bank robbery and I know that there's a serious incident happening on this side of the precinct and say, hey, now there's no resources over here where I can potentially rob a bank or do something like become an active shooter. There's a big potential public safety risk out there with this.
Yeah. Well, we see, look, the big one we talk about is active shooter. A lot of active shooters put a lot of planning into what they do. We see it with manifestos that they write and years of planning. So to do something like this is absolutely poor judgment to pass it is poor judgment on the legislature's side, and will absolutely put people at risk. So our last hope is the governor on that one.
Right. Now, one of the other bills that, we were paying attention to that is potentially bad, but on its face may sound good. I think we just need a little more clarification and defining of what they're exactly talking about, is the removal of candidates from eligibility lists when it comes to hiring police officers. And them being able to take somebody off an eligibility list based on good moral character or the lack of good moral character, which on its face sounds good and right. I think we just need a little more clarity on what good moral character will be defined as and who will be making this definition. Because, somebody like me, where I've been very vocal in my opinion of being trans people being involved in female sports, right? I think it's a huge risk to females when it comes to athletic competition. And the whole point of separating men, male and female sports to begin with was to give females that equal opportunity to compete, the possibility of scholarship opportunities in the future after high school and into college. So I think, will somebody question my moral character based on my feeling of trans people competing in high school athletics?
I kind of chuckle because that is the exact argument that was made up there. Basically, the way legislation gets introduced, it gets assigned to a committee, then it could move anywhere from 1 to 2 to 3 to 5 committees before it gets to the floor for a vote. What we try and do is when we subscribe to software that I track legislation and I see when it's going into committee. So I'll attend those committee meetings along with all other law enforcement.
Right.
So this one in particular I tracked, and this goes to show that we don't just do what our membership needs. We look at not only what cops across New York State need, we look at people who want to be cops.
Right.
And I think of, anyone's kids who, a lot of law enforcement want the kids to come into the career. So this one was unique where they said of good moral character. And that's such a broad term.
Right.
So I sat in the committee meetings and the debate was had where some of the other legislators brought up the argument and were saying, what is the definition of that? And who gets to determine that? And it was basically deferred to the agencies, or it was left vague and it was left wide open. And what a dangerous thing to let society go. Because imagine, like that example, and you use whether it be an opinion about trans or LGBTQ, or an opinion about politics or your party registration.
Right.
You would never allow someone to have the leeway in employment decisions based on what do we ban? What do we ban by federal law? Race, religion, color of skin, all of these different things. Yet you're going to allow good moral character to be a standard that's undefined,
right,
and something that we're going to allow a municipality to decide to strike someone from an eligibility list. It's baffling that it passed out of committee. I was surprised. I was shocked that it moved. And then it passed on the floor, which maybe didn't shock me because the party was,
right,
if I'm not mistaken, it was a party vote, the Democrats for, the Republicans against. But it'll be interesting to see whether that gets signed.
Right. And the lack of detail and definition is the issue, right? Because on its face, it sounds good. We don't want cops out there that lack good moral character.
Yeah.
We just need it defined better.
Absolutely, without a doubt.
And I think a prime example of that, just to make sure people understand, is when it came to bail reform, some of the issues were the lack of defining certain terms, right? So we had a case here in Suffolk County where people were arrested. There was probable cause that they dismembered a human corpse and disposed of the body to cover up evidence, right? And because there wasn't probable cause that they committed the murder at the time, these people were released the next day. So even cutting up a human body and disposing of the evidence was not enough to hold people in jail because of the lack of definitive terms or the lack of ability of a judge to be able to have the discretion to say, these are dangerous people. We need to hold them. So the lack of defining things is dangerous and it needs to be paid attention to.
Absolutely, without a doubt. I mean, look, we know if you're testifying in court, you can't get up there and testify about a defendant's criminal history. You can't say, well, by the way, he's convicted also 3 times of prior robberies,
right,
when, so you want to talk about, but you decide in court testimony, moral character and position and history or in dismembering a body, lack of evidence of the fact that they actually killed the body before they chopped up the body. You can say a lot about moral character about individuals. Why did they choose that law enforcement employment list and eligibility list was the place that they're going to allow moral character, a weakly defined area of moral character, to be where they can take an eligible person, strike them from the list, and that person doesn't have a chance at a career now.
So, right. Yeah. So I think we just need to look forward to a more exact definition of what they're looking for there.
Definitely.
So, what else are we looking at into the future? I know you already, mentioned a little bit about what you're looking forward to in 2026. What's on the horizon? What are we working on right now?
So I would say, obviously, look, for a lot of our membership, and I know membership across New York State, all these agencies, a lot of the new employees are in Tier 6. So Tier 6 is something, we have some great meetings with the Comptroller's office, with Tom DiNapoli, who I know was here.
Tom was here. He's a great guest, good friend of ours.
Absolutely. So we have constant conversations about basically, a priority has been from the first time I went up there 5 years ago, right through today, pension reform, trying to enhance Tier 6. Tier 6 will never be brought down to Tier 2. Just like when I said Tier 2 doesn't become Tier 1.
Right.
What we do is we take the tier as it was introduced, and Tier 2 took 20 years to be reformed into what Tier 2 is today. So will I be around for 20 years? I hope I
hope so too.
I love what I do. I love doing the legislative stuff. I will spend every year that I continue to do this working on bringing Tier 6 into an area that is beneficial to those Tier 6 members.
Right.
So enhancing it for them. And what does enhancement mean? So obviously it's a contributory step in the pension system. So something that brings more money into that member's household. So there are a couple of ways to do it. There's, while they're active as a Tier 6 member, there's their contribution. What we're looking at is some type of change to the contribution. So whether there's probably 15 different pieces of legislation that change the type of contribution. Some of those changes include either capping it after 10 years, so you contribute your percentages up to year 10, then you stop contributing. There are other ones that will give you a graduated system where they'll increase the brackets of salary so that you're not reaching 6% contribution as quickly as you are now. Then there are ones that will, the most radical one that I am sure the Comptroller's office is against is taking the 6% and bringing the cap down to 3% across the board. Any of those changes would basically just see your take-home salary be a little bit more. Right. And that ties into improving the family, the raising the kids, so. And
that'll help with recruitment too, because we've seen throughout the state, throughout the nation, the amount of people that grow up wanting to be cops now has dropped dramatically.
Absolutely.
We have less people taking the test than ever. Our last test saw a 67% drop from our peak back in the late 90s. And we need to make sure that these jobs stay attractive for people as they're growing up. We need to make sure we can compete in the job market to have qualified individuals wanting to be cops who have good moral character.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So, well, look, you see that across the board, and we've talked to the Comptroller's office about this. It's not just law enforcement. It's his own offices even struggling to have staff and bring on
public
staff.
Service as a whole.
Absolutely, without a doubt. And part of the arguments are recruitment and retention, and that ties into making and New York affordability. And part of that is when you're contributing to the pension, how do you keep a little bit more of that?
Right.
So,
and we always tie closely into law enforcement because obviously that's who we are. But this pension tier reform, it affected teachers, it affected school custodians, it affected all those public workers that you see out on the roadways, working in any public building. If you're a nurse in a public hospital.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that also ties into a group we didn't mention that we're a part of, which is PEC, the Public Employees Conference of New York State. So that represents hundreds of unions, hundreds of thousands of members across New York State, from transit workers, nurses, teachers, communication worker, linesmen, and law enforcement. And I'll lobby up there with them because we all, look, the reality is, and sometimes it's lost on what we do every day, we are labor. That is what we are. We are labor. We're a unique part of labor, where law enforcement, we have a unique task in what we do. We have a different mandate in what we're allowed to do, and enforcing laws, taking away liberty. That's different than a teacher and, a nurse or a transit worker. But the reality is we're labor. The interests for us are equal to the interests of teachers and other municipal employees. So that ties into retention and recruitment and fixing the pension system on behalf of all municipal employees across New York State.
Right. And, as we're sitting here and everything we've discussed today, I think that's a great closing message too, because it ties into everything you do to help all public employees and everybody in New York State. So, Chris, I know you jokingly said you hope to be around for another 20 years. I'm seriously saying I hope you are, because what you do up there is invaluable to our members and the public as a whole. So thank you for everything you do, and thanks for coming on today.
No, my pleasure. Yeah, I'm glad to explain what I do. I know the members, it's this elusive thing, and I'm up there in Albany and stuff, but hopefully, this brings light to what it is we do on behalf of members. They should know, they should reach out to this office with any questions, any issues that they have. If they have any concerns, reach out. We're probably already working on what you're concerned about. So,
but at least we can put your mind a little bit at ease that we're on top of it.
Absolutely. And looking forward to doing it for a lot more years. So.
All right. Thanks a lot, Chris.
My pleasure. Thank you, guys.